Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to speak about the implications of Brexit for the farming industry. I'm not going to make any suggestions or any issues about the rest of the food chain. It's just about the farming sector. So I think actually Alan said that, I mean, he quoted from our document at the beginning. So what will be, what's the best result for British agriculture? It's impossible to answer.
Sit down.
No, I can stand. It's impossible to answer because we don't know, although we know what the advantages and disadvantages of being inside the European Union are, we've no idea what Brexit would mean for agriculture. And there is a particular reason why that's an even more difficult question to answer, and I'll come on to that. So just some of the themes I wanted to cover were access to market, and these have already been sort of mentioned by previous speakers. Access to markets, what kind of import protection we'll face outside the European Union, what would the future British agriculture and environment policy look like, what would be our access to labour, and what would be the issues on regulation. I think those are, for us, they're absolutely key issues. Now, why is it impossible to answer what would life be like outside the European Union? I think two reasons. One is, at the moment, the implication is that the Prime Minister is going to recommend that we stay inside the European Union, therefore the government policy would be that we'd stay in. So those who are advocating that we'd leave, what lockers do they have in this debate? How can they make promises that they are not necessarily in a position to be able to deliver? That makes it very difficult to know what would be the case. And take the example of the Scottish referendum. Although there were huge uncertainties around certain issues, one thing was certain, that if the Scottish people had voted to leave the UK, the Scottish government, the SNP, would be the government that would be in charge of doing that. Whereas in this case, we're assuming that that's not the case at all. And those people who advocate Brexit really are a coalition of total opposites. And I've somewhat caricatured this by looking at the two leading lights of the UK Independence Party. So Nigel Farage on the one hand and Carswell on the other, Douglas Carswell on the other. They're completely different personalities. There's no doubt that they dislike each other quite thoroughly. One is the leader of the party, the other is the only MP. They have utterly different views, and in fact, they've joined different Leave campaigns. So, they are completely different. I think the broad themes of that lead people to want to leave the European Union are twofold. On the one hand, at one extreme, you've got people who blame the European Union for opening up the British economy, making it more open to globalization, making us a more open society. And on the other hand, people who blame the European Union for not allowing us to have a more open relationship with the rest of the world and for getting in the way of globalization. So, those two people would absolutely characterize those two issues. So, looking at the different issues that I raised, there's no doubt that the biggest importance for agriculture is our access to the single market. 73% of British agricultural exports go to the rest of Europe, which is a higher percentage than the rest of the economy. So incredibly important, and for some sectors, absolutely vital. The sheep sector, 1/3 of every lamb born in the UK is exported to the rest of Europe. So, utterly vital. As you can see, exports to Europe, which is the bottom of the bar, have been growing. Exports to the rest of the world slightly more in recent years. That's not surprising because obviously Europe is a more mature market, but still, absolutely vital market for us. So if we left the European Union, what would be our options for market access to that market so vital? One would be we just do what the Norwegians and Icelanders do, which is join the European Economic Area, which means we have exactly the same access to the single market. We're in a customs union, as Alan said. That would be obviously almost the status quo. I'd actually point out that Norway and Iceland aren't in the single market for agriculture, but they are for other issues. What would be the implications for that? Obviously, in those cases, Norway, Iceland have to pay a contribution to the EU budget. In the case of Norway, it's about 70% pro rata of what we pay. So we wouldn't have the budgetary benefit. We would have to abide by all the single market rules and regulations without having any say in what those regulations are, because we wouldn't have any European Commissioner, we wouldn't have any MEPs, we wouldn't have a minister at the Council of Ministers. So that's the Norwegian example. It's not as many, I think everyone from all sides of the debate say that's not ideal. We could try and arrange have a free trade agreement, which the Swiss have. The Swiss wanted to enter the European Economic Area, but by referendum they were told they couldn't. So they negotiated a free trade agreement, which is very complicated, took 10 years to complete, which has some of the characteristics of being inside the single market, but not others. And they do have to abide by many of the same regulations. Or if we had no arrangements with the rest of Europe, we'd have what would be the default position in the World Trade Organization, which would mean we would continue with our current European tariffs against Europe, and Europe would have the same tariffs against us. One implication of that, which Alan kind of slightly hinted at but didn't expose, was that we could, let's go over to import access options. If we were outside the European Union, but still obviously bound by WTO rules, we could cut our tariffs, and that's, I think, what Alan said he would like to see, but we couldn't increase them. If we cut them, then obviously by WTO rules of ergo omnes, we'd also have to cut our tariff protection against the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe would have no reciprocal obligation to do the same. So those who say, and it's quite often said, that we would be bound to have a favourable free trade arrangement with the rest of Europe because the rest of Europe is more important to them than it is to us, and that they've got a trade surplus. I think that's a very flawed argument. I think our total is 65 free trade agreements that have to be renegotiated with the rest of the world, with, as Alan said, probably no people to do it. And as I said before, we could reduce WTO tariffs, but that would have the consequences that we would have an unfavourable arrangements vis-à-vis Europe. The second issue is what kind of agricultural policy would we have outside the European Union? At the moment, the common agricultural policy is largely characterised by these direct payments, and at the moment, because world prices are very low, farmers are particularly dependent on single payments. In fact, in many sectors, it's the difference between they're making a loss or a profit. As you see in this, you can see the agricultural element of farmers' individual accounts as the bottom line of that. And you can see that cereal farmers, in the last year that these figures came, cereal farmers, cattle farmers, lowland hill farmers, mixed farmers, were all making a loss from their actual agricultural activities. That was only the single market which put them in surplus. And at the time this was made, dairy price was very high, so that wasn't the case, but it's certainly the case now that dairy farmers are doing that. So it's obviously an important issue for farmers to know, would those single farm payments continue? Well, it has been promised by UKIP that they would continue them, and I think that promise has now been echoed by one of the Vote Leave campaign, one of the exit campaign groups, saying that we just continue doing what we do in Europe. I think that's dubious, but why is it dubious? Because the actual Treasury position and DEFRA position coming back from 2005 is that we should eliminate all direct payments by 2020. That was obviously a Labour government. That was reaffirmed in 2011 by the coalition government. So the three main parties are all bound, as it stands at the moment, by the policy of eliminating those payments. And as I said, UKIP policy is that they would continue them, and the Vote Leave campaign also say that. But it is odd that the main lights of the Vote Leave campaign are people who in the past have very, very strongly criticised the direct payments as being wasteful and of no advantage. Next issue is availability of labour. There are over 34,500 non-UK employees, full-time employees in British agriculture. 65% of them are from the EU. Unfortunately, we have no stats on temporary labour, but in the last year we had a seasonal agricultural worker scheme for temporary labour. We had 21,250 Bulgarian and Romanians in that scheme. So it's probable that something like over 20,000 casual temporary labour comes from the rest of Europe on top of the full-time ones. And as Tim quite rightly said, for the horticultural sector, that's absolutely key. Without that, we probably wouldn't be able to produce most of our fruit and vegetables, of which, as Tim also said, we have a big deficit. Now, the last issue was one of EU legislation, and that is probably the issue which makes some farmers think that they'd be better off outside the EU, because they somehow believe that if we were outside the EU, we would escape a lot of the burdensome legislation. And there is a lot of it, 40,000 legal acts in force. However, if we were to do the Norwegian example, be in the European Economic Area, you can see, I'm not going to read them all out, but most of the issues which farmers complain about are also obligations in Norway. Now, on regulation, it's absolutely clear, and no one can dispute this, there are some definitely very inappropriate and disproportionate European regulations. That's goes without saying. But as I've already said, if we want access to the single market, we would have to abide by all of those regulations. If we wanted a free trade area, we'd probably have to abide by most of them. So legislation is the price of single market access. So it's not something you can escape if you still want to have access to markets. The next point I make is one of the things that's just very often complained about by farmers is that you get European regulations in the form of directives that have to be transposed into British law, and what happens is a process of gold plating is that in the process of transposing into British law, they become more constraining. If that's the case, then the problem is with us and not with the European regulation. And finally, it's undoubtedly the case that, as I said, that some European legislation is disproportionate or inappropriate. Some national legislation is also bad, and some of the things that farmers complain about comes from national legislation, not European. So that's it. Thank you very much.